Discover the 8 best ways to avoid crowds in a cruise port. I'm Gary Bembridge. This is another of my tips for travelers. I'm here on a cruise, and one of the things I realized is there were a couple of ports where I wanted to avoid crowds because I knew there would be a lot of people descending in one place at one time on cruise ships. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to share with you my 8 tips on how to avoid crowds in cruise ports, starting with this one. I always check before I go on a cruise how busy each of the ports are going to be. There's some really good sites that you can do it very easily. So for example, the one I like to use is called cruisetimetables.com. So you can input the ports or you can input your itinerary and check just how busy each of the ports are going to be. This is fantastic because bear in mind, some Caribbean ports could have 20,000 people. Places in Europe like Santorini, for example, these places can be absolutely swamped depending on how many ships are there. So I always take a look at how busy the ports are going to be and then plan what I'm going to do around how busy I know the ports are going to be so I can avoid the big crowds there. The other thing to do linked to that is if you are actually booking more in shoulder periods, so for example in the Mediterranean, if you go May-June time or September-October time, you're going to find that the crowds are much less because the land tourists are not going to be there to the same degree because they're going to be there in the summer months, July, August. The same in the Caribbean. If you go in the August period or you even go in the December period, all those places are going to be really busy. So look at the more shoulder periods. It's a really good way of avoiding crowds. Check and know how many people are going to be there. My second tip, of course, is a very obvious one. Stay on board. There's an enormous amount of things you can do on board a ship in a port. Cruise lines will run whole activity programs even on port days. So there'll be loads of things to do. There'll be classes, there'll be talks, there'll be facilities to use. There'll be loads and loads of things to do. So you'll be able to keep busy and happy on board. A good way of avoiding crowds in a port is go local. Seek out and find people who live and work locally and ask them for tips and advice. Now, there's a couple of things you can do. The simplest thing, of course, is to just get a taxi, ask the taxi driver to take you to places that the locals are going to go and are going to be less busy with tourists. There are a couple of more organized ways you can do that. You can plan those in advance. And there's a whole load of sites which are manned and arranged by locals, some of which are just local tips, some of which will provide local guides, some of which are even free guides. An example of some of those is spottedbylocals.com, globalgreeternetwork.info, free walking tours by locals.com, and toursbylocals.com. I find those sites really helpful as a resource because these are people who live there, they've grown up there, they work there, and they know all the tricks and tips around how to avoid the big crowds. Many of them provide free tours and all you do then is pay gratuities. You give them a tip for their time, but definitely go local. Look for locals to help you avoid the crowds because bear in mind, they're also experts at avoiding the crowds in their hometowns. Go local. Another of my favorite ways of avoiding crowds in ports is quite a simple one, and that's to get as far away from the port as possible and to be as active as possible. Most of the people on a cruise ship will come off the ship and stay close to the port, and that's where lots of businesses and activities set up because they know that's kind of a captive audience. So you'll find a lot of the activities are really focused around that spot. However, if you head off in the opposite direction, so you find little local streets. So for example, in Venice, crazy busy, but if you actually head off in a different direction down the side streets, you find lots of really interesting things and you don't find all the crowds. So get as far away as possible. There's different ways you can do that. I mean, there's a lot of places now you can hire bikes or e-bikes or just simply planning in advance, but get as far away as possible. Also, really important, the more active you are, you'll find less crowds. So for example, if you go to Kotor, there's lots of people and it's very busy, but if you decide to walk up the huge big hill behind the city, the old town, almost no one does that because it looks really scary and it looks really active. It's not actually that bad at all. If you look for more active things, there will always be less people there. So go as far away as possible and be as active as possible as you can. That's something that I use an awful lot, and I find it's a really good way of avoiding crowds. Crowds from cruise ships tend to congregate close to the port and where it's an easy thing to do. Another great way of avoiding crowds, which is linked to that, is avoid the obvious, the famous places. Most ports of call have iconic and significant things that people want to go and see. That's often why the cruises are going there. But everyone's going to go and see that. So that's where all the crowds are going to congregate. So what you should do is look for either tours or places yourself to go to that are not the obvious ones. So in Barcelona, everyone heads off to the Ramblas, but very few people actually head right back up the hill where the Olympic Park was. Or if you're going to the Grand Cayman, everyone goes to 7 Mile Beach instead of some of the beaches on the other parts of the island. In Civitavecchia, everyone heads up to Rome. There are other excursions that go to an ancient Etruscan city of the dead called Cerveteri. So when you head to a place, don't just go to the famous places. If you want to avoid the crowds, look for the things that are off the beaten track. Look at the things that are lower down the list of things to do. If you look at the excursions offered by either the cruise line or even independent providers, look at the tours which are going to places you've perhaps never heard of, because it's unlikely that the crowds are going to be heading there. One thing linked to that is I love in ports using the hop-on, hop-off bus. I find a really inexpensive way of getting around, hearing some commentary and finding unusual places. As you head around on the hop-on, hop-off bus, you're going to find that people are getting off at certain stops where the famous things are. Actually get off on the stops where no one's getting off, because then the crowds aren't going to be there, but there's going to be something interesting to do, otherwise the bus wouldn't be stopping there. We found some great places, some great beaches, some really interesting sites by getting off at the stops that other people aren't. Another really good tip and thing that I do to avoid crowds is timing. The way the cruising works is the minute that the ship is cleared in a port, the tours start going and people are in a rush to get off the ship. So people leave as early as the ship docks. They all tend to then come back around lunchtime to eat on board the ship, and often then spend the afternoon on board the ship. So the critical thing to do is to go against that flow. So for example, go out exploring in the afternoon, or if you've got an overnight, stay out late, or actually get up really early in the morning, even before breakfast, head out and do your sightseeing really early and perhaps have breakfast out. The morning is going to be really, really busy wherever you go to. Lunchtime is a great time to go to some of the big sites. You'll find a lot of the cruise passengers will head back to the ship to have their meals. A lot of people don't like to then pay for meals out and about. So lunchtime is a really great time to go to some of the famous and big sites if that's where you want to go. Bear in mind, as soon as the ship arrives, it's going to be everybody rushing out on excursions. Afternoons, lunchtimes, as late as possible. So if you have an all aboard time, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, do your sightseeing at the end of the day. It's also really good, of course, for photography because the light's even better. So timing is really key to avoiding crowds. Cruise passengers are very predictable in the way that they see places and sites, and go against that flow. Another thing that I like to do to avoid crowds is to go on tours that have either early access or after closing access, or to actually book tickets which enable you to go early to places, or will give you a skip the line entrance into a place. There's a couple of ways you can do that. So some cruise lines will have tours which have early opening access. So for example, in St. Petersburg, we were able to get into the Hermitage Museum an hour before it opened. So we'd almost finished our tour before the big crowds arrived, and there was a slight premium for that. You can also often go online to the places you want to go and see and book fast pass entries. So what I often do, if there's specific sites or museums or really tall buildings like the Empire State Building or whatever that you want to go and see, I will always buy the fast pass way so that you can scoot past everybody and go and see the sites and avoid the lines and the crowds. Much more efficient. There are a couple of resources online. So for example, avoid-crowds.com, which at the moment is really focused on Europe. They give you lots of tips for all of the key cities on how you can actually go and when you should go to avoid crowds. So look at resources like that. But cruise lines will often offer early access and there's fast passes, or use resources online to find ways of going when the crowds aren't there. Of course, even on some sites like Google, for example, they often will do a how busy things are by the hour. So look at when the crowds are going to be there and try and plan to buy tickets for entry or to go on tours when it's not going to be busy. It sounds kind of obvious, but people don't look. I've also learned another little trick over the years of cruising to avoid crowds, and that's particularly in really busy ports, is go on home cooking or craft type tours. So there's increasingly lots of tours where you can go and eat in families' homes, or you'll go to a small artisan bakery or cooking class. Those are really small numbers, very few people, and it's really a great way of avoiding crowds because you're just going to have a small group of you. Increasingly, cruise lines are starting to offer those excursions. You're also able to find a lot of those yourself. So for example, one of the sites that I like to look at is a site called eatwith.com, and in lots of places around the world, you're able to book meals, home cooked meals, or cooking classes with people who live locally. So it's a great way of avoiding the crowd because some of them will only take 4 or 6 people. Some of the cooking classes, of course, may be up to 15 people or so, but you can avoid the big crowds and the busy places. There's lots of ways of avoiding crowds in a port when you're on a cruise. I hope you found this bunch of ideas really helpful. I'd love it if you watch many more videos. I have loads of videos of cruising tips and advice. So why don't you actually go and watch another one of those right now?